can follow up. I'll also stop this the transcription because it's not an accurate. It's not as accurate as a person who is doing it. So at this point, we are 47 a number. So I think we should go ahead. So like I mentioned at the introductory class at the beginning of the semester, I was saying that we divided the semester into two. We used the first part of the semester to familiarize ourselves with some concepts in language that we need in our business as critical thinkers. So there are certain concepts we need to know. So the first part of the semester was somehow a language course, a brief language crash program designed to launch us into critical thinking. We started by seeing the different kinds of speech acts. There's different kinds of speech acts, questions, imperatives, declaratives. And then in the declaratives, we saw definitions, factual statements, value judgments, And then the next week, we focused on definitions and their problems. We saw various types of definitions, the lexical and the rest. Then we saw types of discourses. From types of discourses, we looked at certain expressions that are not useful in critical thinking, expressions like metaphors, proverbs, expressions that do not lend themselves to logical analysis. And then from there, we saw some meaning defects in language, some meaning defects. And then we saw some senses of law. And after looking at the senses of law, we went into logic. And by going into logic, we saw the different categories of reason, deductive and inductive. We studied deductive reasoning, and then we went to inductive reasoning. We also saw causal reasoning, which we said is a kind of inductive reasoning. Then we looked at informal fallacies. Okay. So let us start from the beginning. And if anyone has any questions, you can ask before we start looking at our first lesson. Do you have any preliminary questions? Okay, so we saw speech acts. Speech acts. We said the speech act is an utterance, any utterance at all, that performs a certain function in language and communication. So any utterances in general are speech acts. And the usual question is, what kind of utterance or what kind of speech acts? In that sense, speech acts have been divided or categorized. We have questions, which we call interrogatives. We have requests. We have imperatives, which can come in the form of requests, commands, directives, please. And then we have declaratives, which can come in the form of factual statements, value judgments, definitions. Okay. So for the types, interrogatives are what we call questions, the ending question mark. We saw the examples, Then we saw the imperatives, which are utterances we make when we want someone to do something. When we want something to be done, we utter an imperative. And we have hard and soft types. The hard ones range from the directives to the commands to the requests, and soft ones range from pleas to supplications to prayers. So, and then we saw examples of these different colors of imperatives. Then the declaratives, sentences we make or utterances we make when we want to convey information. And there are different types. When we are conveying factual information, there are factual statements. When we are conveying information about our values and preferences, then we're talking about value judgments or value statements. Then when we are saying something about the meaning of something, what something means, then we're talking about definitions. And then when we are making a proposal or claim or conclusion with some support, then that will be argument. So factual statements, we saw it, statements about the state of affairs in the external world. You can verify factual statements by checking the facts. You look at examples, we saw examples. Definitions are sentences or utterances whose job is to tell us about meaning, and we saw examples. Then we saw value judgments, which are utterances we make to express our values and preferences. We saw examples. We said we have moral and non-moral types of value judgments. The moral ones have to do with things we approve and don't approve, and then the non-moral ones are things we talk about when we are talking about aesthetics or utility values such as durability, efficiency, productivity, and all that. When you say something is strong or something is durable or something will last long or something is productive or something is efficient, or something is high class, those things are value statements, non-moral value statements. Or something is beautiful. Then we saw emotive expressions, sentences expressing feelings. We saw examples. We saw sentence fragments, we are examples. We said sentence fragments are incomplete sentences that don't have a noun or a verb. Then we did some exercises, which I hope you did again after our class. And on a general note, I encourage you to do your exercises because they are the sort of things that establish the knowledge in a more solid manner. Then then in the second week we treated definitions. Let me get the slide. Definitions. Okay, so this is definitions. And then while we're at it, definitions, we had introduced our session on definition by talking about two types of meanings. We're talking about connotation and denotation. And we said connotation is the descriptive meaning of something. If you are able to write down the meaning of something, then that is the connotative meaning of that thing. So connotative meaning is the descriptive meaning. Of course, you know that it is only descriptive meanings you can write down. You can't write down non-descriptive meanings. Okay. Then denotations are more like examples of the word out there in the world, in terms of items in the world, you know. So connotation is descriptive meaning, denotation is like the example, something that represents that word out there. That's the denotation. Then we saw the distinction between definiendum and definiens. Definiendum is that which we are defining. When a definiens is that part of the sentence that is defining the definiendum. You know. So the definiendum is like the subject of the sentence. The definiens is like the predicate of the sentence. And we saw types of definitions. We saw lexical, dictionary definitions. We saw ostensive definitions. Ostensive definitions are non-verbal definitions. Okay, sorry, I was briefly interrupted. So ostensive definitions are, the non-verbal, kinds of definitions. Ostensive means to demonstrate. So an ostensive definition is the type that you execute by demonstrating rather than by description. Ostensive definition is for those things you cannot define descriptively. There are certain things you can't define descriptively, such as colors. So in those cases, it is only the denotations of those things that is useful. They are examples, items representing them in the world. So only denotations are useful. Connotations, there are no connotations for ostensive definitions. So ostensive definitions don't have any descriptive meaning. So they have no connotations. They have only denotations. Then we saw theoretical definitions from different disciplines. So inflation, for instance, is from economics. Bipolar disorder is from psychology. Viral load is from biochemistry. So there are certain words that emerge or originate from certain disciplines. So the definitions of those words are theoretical definitions. For instance, a viral load is a numeral expression of the quantity of virus in a given volume of fluid. So you will know theoretical definitions when you see them. Then we have stipulative. Stipulative definitions are those kinds of definitions that we formulate personally in different situations that call for an original or new definition. For instance, the Ghanaian word frenemy means a person who is an enemy pretending to be a friend, or someone who is a friend but also a rival or an opponent. Then we have the operational definition, so which are definitions that reflect some kind of operation. For instance, a solution is an acid if and only if litmus paper turns red when dipped into it. A substance is translucent if and only if, when held up to a strong light, some of the lights come through. So this, the appearance of these definitions will tell you that they are operational definitions. And then we have the essential definition. The essential definitions would be those definitions that satisfy the conditions, all the conditions of the definiendum. Essential definitions are those definitions that are truly accurate. Those definitions that capture the necessary and sufficient conditions for the definiendum. And such definitions are normally in mathematics. Outside mathematics, it is almost impossible to get essential definitions. For instance, a prime number is any number divisible by only itself and 1. So essential definitions are definitions that they apply all the time without exception to the definiendum. There is no time they will fail to define a definiendum, and there is no time that they will fall short of accuracy in defining the definiendum. Anytime you see the definiens, you indirectly see the definiendum. But outside mathematics, it's difficult to get such definitions. Most other definitions are called essentially contested definitions. They don't always capture the necessary and sufficient conditions for the definiendum. If, for instance, you define a table, and you say a table is a four-legged object on which we write, eat food, and study, and other things. Eventually, you find out that that definition is contestable. We have three-legged tables. We have some tables with 3 legs, not 4 legs. We have some tables with 6 legs. And then tables are not only used for eating, studying, and for writing. They could also be used for other things. They could be used to butcher meat. They could be used to do so many things. So whatever definition you supply for table, it's not a definition that can always stand. We call it an essentially contestable definition. And that applies to all definitions outside essential definitions. Essential definitions are found mostly in mathematics. That is where accuracy is fully sustainable. Okay. Then we solve problems with definitions. When definitions fail to be accurate, they could have one problem solve the other. Definitions could be too broad if what they describe refers to more items than are needed to describe the definiendum. When you say, for instance, a toy is a machine. Machine, there are so many machines that are not toys. Machine is a broader category than toys, so definition is too broad. And then definitions could be too narrow when their description refers to denotations or items that are not sufficient to describe the definiendum. Or if you say a toy is a tiny car used by infants to play, the tiny car is not sufficient to define toy, because there are other toys apart from tiny cars. Tiny cars are just a fraction of toys. So the definition is too narrow. Then we have definitions that are vague, when there's no way of telling what class of items the definition refers to. If you say democracy is a kind of government where there's freedom for all, so that's vague, because all is too broad. All could be all human beings and animals. Okay, and then we have ambiguous definitions. A definition could be ambiguous if the definition presents more than one possible meaning of the definiendum. So when you say faith is true belief, or when you say a triangle is a figure composed of 3 straight lines, intersecting at 3 different points in which all the angles are equal to 180. So these are ambiguous definitions because true belief could either mean sincere belief or a belief that is not false. And if you're talking about a triangle of 3 lines, you wonder if each of the 3 lines is equal to 180 or a combination of the 3 lines is equal to 180. You know, so definitions that could present more than one possible meaning. A definition could be secular if the definiens is actually a repetition of the definiendum. You know, morality is to be morally right. That's a secular definition. Metaphysics is the study of metaphysical issues. Secularity. Okay. Then begging a question, we saw begging a question, definition that is obscure or digresses from providing meaning or does not help in shedding meaning on the definiendum. You know. So if you define Jubilee House as the office where every Ghanaian would want to be, that definition does not really, it digresses from the work of a definition. You know. So the correct definition of Jubilee House is a name given to the office of the President of Ghana. All right, so from there we looked at discourses. So let's look at discourses. You know, a discourse is also called a passage. And we have different types of passages. We have argumentative passages and we have non-argumentative passages. For the argument, a discourse is an argument if it contains a claim or conclusion that is supported with reasons or information. You know. So, for you to have an argument, there must be a claim or a conclusion. And then that claim or conclusion has to be supported with reasons or information. Example, Ghanaian men think women don't deserve to occupy high positions. 2, they question the competence and qualification of women who are sent to high office, but refrain from doing same to even incompetent men. 3, therefore Ghanaian men do not respect women. So you notice that the above passage has 3 statements. Statements 1 and 2 are serving as information, evidence or reasons to support statement 3. So for attempting to support statement 3, these statements 1 and 2 are called premises. And then statement 3, which is being supported, is called conclusion. And then we studied ways of identifying arguments. You know, there are certain expressions or phrases or words that, you know, tell you you are looking at either a premise or a conclusion. Those that tell you are looking at a premise are called premise indicators, and those that tell you are looking at a conclusion are called conclusion indicators. You know. So for the premise indicators, we have certain examples. You also have the conclusion indicators, which I believe you saw in your last class. Then we have the non-arguments, narratives, instructional passages, rhetorical polemic. A narrative is just a report of a sequence of events. Any story is a narrative because a collection of sentences, each of them reporting a sequence of events. Instructional passage is a passage that describes a process or sequence of things to do in a specific order. So an instructional passage is a list of directives. For instance, if someone tells you, you are going to, since you are going to Accra Mall from University of Ghana main campus, get into a taxi to the University of Ghana Uponglu entrance. From there, get into a bus and alight at what they call Spanner. And from there, you get onto the flyover, cross over to the left corner of the road, and then you can see the shopping mall just ahead of you. You know, so those statements are called, form what we call an instructional passage. You know, a passage that is a collection of imperatives, telling you what to do in a sequence, you know. Then rhetorical polemics, a passage communicating usually strong feelings. So rhetorical polemic is usually a passage containing emotive expressions. Emotive expressions. Then we have verbal and real disagreements or verbal and real disputes. A verbal dispute is a disagreement about the meaning of a word or words. So when you have a disagreement involving meaning, if people are disagreeing and you listen to their disagreement and you see that the disagreement is actually based on a misunderstanding about the meaning of one word, then that is a verbal disagreement. Example, that man is a fountain. No, he's an Akan. That man is a fountain. No, he's an Akan. The second person doesn't understand that a fountain is an Akan. So when this kind of disagreement leads to a broader conflict or a larger disagreement, you can actually narrow down the disagreement to just this misunderstanding, which is a misunderstanding about the meaning of a word. Once you have clarified the meaning of that word, the whole argument disappears. So that's why we call it a verbal disagreement. We don't see it as a real disagreement. Okay. Then the real disagreements are disagreements about facts and values. If the disagreement is about facts, then it's a real disagreement. If it's about values, then it's real. Factual disagreement: Accra is the capital of Ghana. No, Kumasi is the capital of Ghana. Just assume that strangers who came to Ghana for the first time and who don't know where the capital is are engaged in this disagreement. It is a factual disagreement. Okay, then example 2 is a disagreement about values. Ghanaians themselves could actually have this disagreement. Accra should be the capital of Ghana. No, Accra should not be the capital of Ghana. That's a disagreement about values. Maybe Accra has become too overcrowded, just like Lagos some years ago. And then this argument comes up. Someone says, no, Accra should not be the capital of Ghana. We should look for a capital elsewhere. So that's a disagreement about values or preferences. Then after this class, we saw another class on the normative and the empirical. Normative and empirical. Okay. So in this class, we were supposed to have rehashed our distinction between values and facts. You know that values are about what we should or should not do, and facts are about what is or is not. Sometimes we mistake values for facts. There are factual statements with implicit value judgments. Sometimes you could be looking at a sentence that is obviously or ostensibly a factual statement, but you might not realize it is actually a value judgment until you look closer. Examples. Look at the difference between the following two statements. Statement 1, the president has lifted the lockdown. Statement 2, the president has rightly lifted the lockdown. The first is a factual statement. The second is like the first, but with an implicit value judgment represented by the word rightly. So the second is a value judgment. So when you're looking at a statement, you should look out for both the explicit and implicit meanings of the statement. If you don't look out for both the explicit and implicit meanings of statements, if you don't confirm those two kinds of meanings, you could be misled. So it's very important. Then you must have seen discussed metaphors and proverbs. I would say these are two areas where logicians don't really find relevant to critical thinking, because they don't lend themselves to literal meanings. Now, metaphors are sentences that should not be interpreted literally. Don't judge a book by its cover. It means don't evaluate things just by looking at their appearances. It's raining cats and dogs. It can never rain cats and dogs. So it's raining heavily. Now, it's raining cats and dogs does not lend itself to logical analysis because it can never rain cats and dogs. So metaphors are, utterances that are not really useful in critical thinking because you can't do logic with them. You can't do logical analysis with them. They rely on informal sorts of indirect interpretations, which are not based on logic. Then we have proverb, a sentence with a literal meaning as well as a non-literal one. And the non-literal meaning is usually a piece of advice. So proverbs are multiple purpose speech acts. So proverbs, again, just like metaphors, not really things we use in logical analysis. Okay, so examples of proverbs. Let's not go, you can look at this later. So then we saw meaning defects in language, meaning defects. In addition to metaphors and proverbs, there are expressions whose meanings are defective. Examples, vagueness and ambiguity. Vagueness, an expression is vague when its meaning has no boundaries of application. An expression is vague when its meaning is not precise. Example, he'll be here any moment from now. He'll be here any moment from now. That's vague because any moment from now is ranging from the very next second to the end of the world, or maybe when Jesus comes again. So there is, it has no boundary of application. Any moment from now has no boundary of application. It actually buys the person an infinite amount of time. I'll come see your parents at the right time. At the right time has no boundary of application. Vodka is expensive. Expensive has no boundary of application. What do you mean by expensive? Is it 1 million cedis or is it 100,000 cedis? 100,000 is expensive, at least in our economy. A car that is 100,000 is expensive. Is it 100,000? Is it 1 million cedis or is it even $1 million? So expensive has no boundary of application. It is broad. You need something more specific. Ambiguity. A sentence is ambiguous when it's capable of more than one meaning. So I usually discuss three types of ambiguity. You have the lexical ambiguity, referential ambiguity, and syntactic ambiguity. But I'm not sure that you did this with Lincoln, with Mr. Nusuga. But let's just rush through it. Lexical ambiguity is when ambiguity occurs in a single word, when only one word in the sentence is ambiguous. This type of ambiguity occurs in words that have the same spelling but different meanings. Such words are called homographs. Homographs. A word that is ambiguous is called a homograph. Examples: he lives close to the bank. He lives close to the bank. Does he live close to a river bank or a bank as a financial institution? Military head, 6 arms. Military head, 6 arms. Are you referring to the head, the biological head of the military man, or the head of the military as an institution? And then are you also referring to the biological arms of a military man, or are you referring to things like weapons or ammunitions? Other homographs include race, chest, light, and so on. These words have multiple meanings. So when you're using them, you need to use them in a way or in a manner that makes it clear to the reader which particular meaning of them you intend. Then we have referential ambiguity. This type of ambiguity occurs when a phrase or a word in a particular context could refer to two or more properties or things in a sentence. Referential ambiguity occurs from the use of pronouns and quantifiers. So referential ambiguity is actually the ambiguity of pronouns. When a pronoun is ambiguous. The boy told his father about the theft case, and he was very upset. The boy told his father about the theft case, and he was very upset. Who is upset, or who was upset, the boy or the father? The pronoun he does not specify which of the nouns in the sentence it is referring to. See. He used deceit to sell that soap to me, but I did not buy it. He used deceit to sell that soap to me, but I did not buy it. So what did I not buy? The deceit or the soap? So here too, the pronoun it fails to specify which noun it is referring to. So that's what we call referential ambiguity. Referential ambiguity. It's different from lexical ambiguity, which is the ambiguity of a single word. Then we have sentential ambiguity. Sentential ambiguity, syntactic or sentential ambiguity. When a sentence contains two or more possible meanings, then the sentence is ambiguous. So sentential ambiguity occurs when it is clear what the individual words in the sentence mean, but it is not clear what the whole sentence means. So in a sentential ambiguity, each of the words is clear. There is no ambiguous word, but the sentence as a whole is ambiguous. So the ambiguity comes from the combination of the words, not from the ambiguity in a single word. Examples. Today we shall be discussing violence on TV. Today we shall be discussing violence on TV. Is it that the discussion of violence will be held on a TV program, or that violence on TV will be the topic of discussion? Yeah. Then another example, the dean will talk about cheating in the seminar room. The dean will talk about cheating in the seminar room. Is the dean going to talk about cheating that happened in the seminar room? Or is cheating the topic of the lecture she is going to deliver in the seminar room? Okay. So those are the three types of ambiguity, which are not in your recommended textbook, but I brought it from my own textbook, the textbook I wrote with some lecturers, which is supposed to have been an updated, presentation of critical thinking. Now, but I brought it in so that because it can help you when you are dealing with ambiguities in general. Okay, so difference between vagueness and ambiguity. A vague term does not indicate a clear boundary of applying the meaning of the term. On the other hand, an ambiguous term gives us ideas about what it means, but suggests more than one accepted meaning. An ambiguous term gives us ideas of what it means, but suggests more than one accepted meaning, leaving us confused as to which of the meanings particularly is intended. So vagueness means no clear meaning. Ambiguity means more than one accepted meaning. Okay. So vagueness and ambiguity can facilitate equivocation and disagreement in language. And then the role of vagueness and ambiguity can also be found in metaphors and proverbs. So equivocation is when someone shifts unannounced from one meaning of a word to another meaning of the same word in the same passage. This is usually done with the hope of confusing the reader. Equivocation is to take advantage of ambiguity, particularly lexical ambiguity, the ambiguity of a single word, because equivocation means taking advantage of the ambiguous nature of words to persuade or confuse readers. So we'll see equivocation again later, later in our revision. All right, so I hope you did your equivocation very well. Examples: time flies like an arrow and fruit flies like a banana. The first flies is a verb, meaning moving in the air. The second flies is a noun indicating fruit insects. The first like is used for the purpose of comparison. The second like is used as a verb indicating a preference for something. Okay, so you have other examples which you can look at your study time or spare time. Okay, so what's the strategy? How do we identify an equivocation? Strategy for identifying equivocation. First of all, ascertain whether a word has been used more than once in the sentence or passage. Find out in a sentence or a passage which words have been used more than once. Pin down or write down or isolate those words that have occurred more than once. And then the next step is to check if the word has different meanings in that passage. Does the word have different meanings in that passage or sentence? If you're able to make these two observations, then the sentence or passage contains equivocation. All right. Note that vagueness, ambiguity, and equivocation are very important in clarifying arguments. If certain expressions are vague or ambiguous in an argument, their meanings need to be clarified before we can proceed to evaluate the argument. So the reason why we bring out time to study and discuss vagueness, ambiguity, and equivocation, is that they make or mar an argument. Arguments depend on meaning, of course. So if meanings are defective, it will automatically affect argument. And an argument cannot be effective if it was using ineffective meanings or if it relied on ineffective meanings. Then we saw the senses of law, which I hope you discussed. And we're saying that there's no single definition of law. You cannot say law is this. No. The definition of law depends on the type of law. There are various senses of law. So to define law would be to define law in a particular sense. For instance, you have natural law. Natural laws are also called scientific laws, and they refer to statements describing the regularity or uniformity in the pattern of events or property of things in the world. So we form these laws based on past experiences. If, for instance, you observe that the sun always rises in the east and sets in the west, then that's a natural or scientific law. You can see that the definition of this kind of law will be different from the definition of any other kind of law. And other examples of natural law: planets revolve around the sun, the atomic weight of gold is 12, animals survive on oxygen, anything that has weight falls to the ground if suspended in the air. Then we have civil or statutory laws, defined as laws made by man to regulate human behavior, usually legal instruments accompanied by sanction and backed by force. The examples: we have commercial law, tax law, criminal law, corporate law, constitutional law, traffic law, human rights law, and so on. They are all types of civil law. Civil laws must be obeyed by all citizens, and normally they are accompanied by prescribed punishment for disobedience. Then we have cultural norms, social conventions, or social rules. Give me just a second. Okay, so I'm back. So we just saw civil laws. Now we have cultural norms, social conventions, social rules. These are common understandings about how we should do certain things, whether in traditional societies, in the case of cultural norms, or in modern societies, in the case of social conventions, or in any society, group, organization, or institutions, in the case of social rules. Disobedience is not normally punishable, but attracts social disapproval. Examples include how we should dress, speak, receive visitors, worship, eat, observe public holidays, or attend social functions, and so on. Then we have customary law. When a cultural norm becomes a civil law, it becomes statutory, and its disobedience becomes punishable. We have customary courts in rural areas. Okay. Then we have moral law. Moral laws are about rules prescribing how we should or should not behave. Normally they are considered to be universal. Examples: do not steal, kill, discriminate, take another person's spouse, and so on. For a rule of behavior to be regarded as a moral law, such a rule is universally respected. If there's any rule that is not universally respected, then it has not attained the status.
Sir.
Yes.
To find out something about the moral law and then moral value judgment. What is the difference between the two?
Moral value judgment and then moral law. Moral values are not necessarily moral laws. Moral values are about people's moral beliefs. Moral values are about people's moral beliefs, moral preferences, moral aspirations. They are quite different from a moral law. When something is a moral law, when it is a principle that is considered universally acceptable. So that is something that has become established as something that is to be observed by anyone at all, any human being. So it's more specific compared to moral values and beliefs, positions, and preferences. Yes.
I wanted to find out deductive. I think we treat deductive argument earlier, but I didn't ask that question. I wanted to find out deductive argument and inductive argument. Hello.
Someone.
Yeah.
There's a distraction coming from. Sorry, an aircraft is passing just above my house, so the noise is just too much. Just 10 more seconds, and then we continue. Okay, please move on. Go ahead.
Okay.
Repeat
deductive argument and then inductive argument. Which one is the target for empirical scientists?
Empirical scientists are engaged in mostly inductive reasoning, because empirical scientists are, empirical scientists are searching for new solutions to problems. And when you are searching for new solutions, what you are doing is to, do some reflections, come up with your reflections, formulate what you call conjectures, and then transform those conjectures into hypotheses that you have to put to the test. to find out if they are true or not. When you are putting a hypothesis to the test, you are technically involved in an inductive reasoning. So that is what scientists do.
Okay, thank you. One more.
Yes.
Particular statement and general statement. Which one is the target for empirical scientists?
I think they should be using both, but they should be using both. I don't think any of them is really excluded, even though they would more frequently use particular statements.
Okay. So the two, the particular and the general statement, which one have empirical empty, like they don't have empirical content?
Empirical what?
Content, like this some statement like they have empirical content, but which one is empty of empirical content?
The empirical content should be more in particular statements, because the general statements are difficult to be empirical statements, because general statements are normally about all members of an item, whether they are existing or not. So particular statements will be more likely about items that are actually existing. So when you talk about all men, you are talking about men that exist in addition to men that are not existing. But when you are talking about all the men in Ghana, you are talking about men that are actually existing. So the particular statements will be more useful in scientific endeavors.
All right. Thank you very much.
All right. So moral law, we just distinguished moral law as, moral principles that have become quite established and objective enough for everyone to respect, and they have risen or graduated from just mere moral values or preferences. Then we have logical law, which are the rules for reasoning. The most common examples of logical laws were our deductive and inductive reasoning rules. So, example of deductive reasoning: all men are mortal, Kofi is a man, Kofi is mortal. For a logical law, for instance, will be the rule for deductive reasoning, which is that you can only affirm the antecedent and deny the consequent in an argument in order to reach a valid conclusion. So we called it the rule for reasoning. If you had watched my video on deductive reasoning, so that rule, that deductive rule for deductive reasoning, is an example of a logical law. Then we have mathematical laws, rules for mathematical operations. Example: never divide by zero. So all the rules of addition, subtraction, multiplication, and division are mathematical laws. Then we have divine laws, laws credited with a supernatural source. And examples will depend on the religion in question. For example, in Christianity, there are laws about relating with God, praying, forgiving those who offend us, and so on. Those are all divine laws. They are credited with a supernatural source. That is, it is believed that those laws came from a supernatural source. All right, so that was about the normative and the empirical. After this class, we went into deductive reasoning. So this class was the summation, the end of the first half of the semester, which was supposed to usher us into the second half. And the second half of the semester was about arguments. And when we come to arguments, we began from deductive reasoning. So deductive reasoning, we were saying, or you must have been told that arguments are also called reasoning or syllogisms, and the three terms are used interchangeably. You can say argument, or you can say reasoning, or you can say syllogism. They are interchangeable. And then the two major categories of reasoning are the deductive and inductive. We also have causal reasoning, which is a form of inductive reasoning. So for the deductive reasoning, we call it deductive argument or syllogism. Reasoning in which the relationship between the premises and the conclusion is a logical relationship. A logical relationship. As a result of this, it is reasoning that permits only one conclusion. Example, all men are mortal, Kofi is a man, therefore Kofi is mortal. So only one conclusion is possible, and that's the one we have here. You cannot change or modify the conclusion. For example, you cannot say Kofi is immortal or say a far cabinet is mortal. So deductive argument is an argument where you simply can't play any tricks. You can't maneuver. It's like a mathematical operation. There is a distinction between reference and attribute classes. We have two parts of the sentence, just like the subject and the predicate. The reference class is the subject, the attribute class is the predicate. So for example, in the sentence, all men are mortal, all men, which is the subject, is the reference class. And then are mortal, which we know as a predicate, is the attribute class. The reference class is that to which the sentence refers, whilst the attribute class is that part of the sentence that is attributing something to or saying something about the reference class. That's why we call it the attribute class. That part of the sentence that is attributing something to or saying something about the reference class. Then we have another distinction between the finite and infinite reference classes. The reference class can be finite or infinite. The infinite reference class refers to all members or non-members of a class, either 100% or 0. Example, all men, no man, any man. Finite reference class refers to countable and particular members of a class, anything between 0 and 100%. Example, some men, 80% of men, 5 men, all the men, few men, almost all the men, and so on. Then we have the universal and particular statements. Statements containing infinite reference class are called universal statements, whilst those containing finite reference classes are called particular statements. Examples of universal statements, all men are mortal. Example of particular statements, some men drink alcohol. Then we saw the issue of validity. An argument is valid if the premises make the conclusion necessary and the conclusion follows with certainty. All valid arguments are deductive arguments. In fact, inductive arguments are strictly not valid. Okay, so deductive arguments or valid argument. Yes.
I wanted to ask a question on the laws, but I wasn't called. I raised my hand, I wasn't called. I wanted to ask if you can clarify, or is there an instance where we can have a statement which is which is a natural law and a scientific law at the same time?
A statement that
can be a natural law and a scientific law.
Natural law and a scientific law.
Yes, please.
Yeah, but both laws are the same. A natural law is in fact a scientific law.
It's a part of scientific law.
No, a natural law is a scientific law.
Oh, okay. Okay, so but should you have a question and the objectives or the answer, you have scientific law and then you have a natural law as the options. Which one are you to choose?
No, scientific law is another name for a natural law.
Okay.
Yes, they are interchangeable. They refer to the same thing. All right. So, okay. So where?
Sir,
Yes.
is general statement the same as universal statement?
General statement, universal statement, general. General, is it being used in that book?
No, sir.
Okay, but well, you have to go with whatever is in the book because it is only what's in the book that the lecturers are going to test you on. General statements, I think it is possible. I think general statements could also be referred to universal statements, but I don't think that general statements are used in Legon. I think general statements could be used in other universities, but not here. All right. So validity, we said valid argument is it's a more or less mathematical argument. There's nothing you can do about the conclusion of the argument. Just like there's nothing you can do about 4 being the result of 2 plus 2. So compare it to an inductive argument. Premise 1, 95% of men are honest. Premise 2, Peter is a man. Conclusion, Peter is honest. In this case, you see that more than one conclusion is possible. Possible conclusion 1, Peter is honest. Possible conclusion 2, Peter is not honest. So this is a typical example of an inductive argument. You see that it gives you the possibility of more than one conclusion. And in fact, you have 2 legitimate conclusions staring at you, even though only one of them will be the one that is written. But you can also infer another one, or even infer its opposite as equally legitimate. So that is one of the fastest ways to identify an inductive argument. And that is also why we say that inductive arguments are strictly not valid. Validity applies only to deductive arguments. Okay, so now we can't go into the details of deductive arguments because we are just doing revision, and the details of a deductive argument actually take time to go through, So to recap what you did for deductive arguments, you did the 4 types of deductive arguments. You did a modus ponens, modus tollens. You did hypothetical syllogism, and then you did the disjunctive syllogism. The modus ponens is an argument that affirms the antecedent. An argument that affirms the antecedent is a modus ponens. And then an argument that denies the consequent is a modus tollens. Then an argument that denies the antecedent is a fallacy of denying the consequent. And then an argument that affirms the consequent is a fallacy of affirming the consequent. Then you have a hypothetical syllogism. The hypothetical syllogism will be an argument, that where the consequent of a particular premise becomes the antecedent of the next premise. And then the conclusion is just a bringing together of the very first antecedent and the very first consequent. So for a hypothetical syllogism, an argument where the consequent of an initial or first premise becomes the antecedent of a second or subsequent premise, and subsequent premises feature the consequence of their predecessors as their antecedents. So the conclusion pairs the very first antecedent with the very last consequent. That's hypothetical syllogism. Example, all A are B, all B are C. Therefore, all C are C. Yeah, I can see someone raise his hand, Francis Abusa, but I don't know when particularly, whether he raised his hand now or sometime in the past, or in which particular topic, discussion or subtopic, Francis. Yes. Yes, go
please. I wanted to know if in inductive reasoning you are probably going to follow the sequence as in two premises before your conclusion, or it is not necessarily followed. I want to know.
Basically, arguments must not have more than one premise. Some arguments have one premise, some have more than one premise. Some arguments have just a single sentence in which one part of the premise, or one part of the sentence is a conclusion, another part is a premise. So the number of premises or how the premises are expressed can vary. A sentence can be an argument because a sentence can contain a conclusion as well as reasons for the conclusion. And then you can have a single premise argument in which you have a conclusion as a sentence and one premise as the reason. So it all depends on the length of the argument. Some arguments are single sentences, some are two sentences, some are three sentences. Some arguments are a whole passage, So if the premises are many, we call it an enumerative argument. An argument with many premises is an enumerative argument,
Thank you, sir.
All right. So when you say, for instance, that if you say that Africa will get to the promised land because Africans are hardworking. Africa will get to the promised land because Africans are hardworking. That's a single sentence argument. One part of the sentence is a conclusion. The other part is a premise, which is a reason for the conclusion. So a one sentence argument would contain both conclusion and premise, and usually, sometimes or very often, the two parts of the argument are linked with the word because, or since, or any of the other conclusion indicators or premise indicators. All right.
Okay, so please, I want to ask a question about what my brother Francis just said. So, I want to know if deductive arguments has only three premises and two premises and one conclusion.
Yeah, but that's the question I just answered. Yeah, but that was exactly the question he asked.
Okay. So is it different? Okay, that's, and then do we have any other type of this thing argument that has maybe more than this thing? Since we have syllogism being 3, that is 2 this thing premises and then 1 conclusion. Do we also have any other this thing?
Yes, it's something that you shouldn't be worried about, because at this point where you are being introduced to deductive arguments, you are given an argument with 2 premises so that you understand how the argument works. These things will not be understood very well if we were teaching you modus ponens and tollens in a single sentenced argument or in a 1 premise argument. The most ideal for teaching types of deductive argument is a 2 premised argument. Okay. Now, if you take a look at any of those arguments, you can actually merge them into 1 sentence. All men are mortal and Kofi is a man, so Kofi is mortal. You just separate them with commas and then a full stop. So it could be a 1 sentence argument. But if it is that way, then it's not very easy to teach, how to look at different forms of the argument. All right, so then we saw hypothetical fallacies. We saw 2 hypothetical fallacies. The first fallacy is all A are B, all B are C, therefore all C are A. All Ghanaians are Africans, all Africans are human beings. Therefore, all human beings are Ghanaians. So that's a hypothetical fallacy. I hope you treated it very well. You understood it very well when your tutor was discussing it. And then the second hypothetical fallacy: all A are C, all B are C, therefore all A are B. Which is also a fallacy. If A, then C. If B, then C. Therefore, if A, then B. First, for instance, all Ghanaians are Africans. All Kenyans are Africans. Therefore, all Ghanaians are Kenyans. So that will be wrong. Okay. So sometimes it can be true by accident, but I don't want us to go into that because you will not be tested by the accident example. Okay, then you have disjunctive syllogism. A syllogism where the main premise is a disjunctive, either or. When we affirm something of any of the disjunctive items, then we have automatically denied it the other disjunctive parts. Either A is true. Sorry. Either A is true or B is true. A is true, so B is false. The second example: either A is true or B is true. B is true, so A is false. Okay.
Sir, please, I want you to show the slide of hypothetical syllogism, please.
No, we are doing revision. If you want to see that, you need to go and watch the video.
Yeah, but sir, please, it's just I wanted to see the fallacy that is being committed. How it's formed. Like I don't get it clear. Like all A's are B's.
Hypothetical fallacy.
Yeah, this one. Yeah, hypothetical fallacy.
Is it the first or second one?
Yeah, the second one. The first one. Okay. Yeah.
Well,
sorry.
The first one
this one is this one.
First fallacy. all A are B, all B are C, therefore all C are A. We said it's a fallacy.
Okay.
Because it's supposed to be therefore all A are C.
Okay.
If you put it in words, all Ghanaians are Africans, all Africans are human beings, therefore all human beings are Ghanaians. It's supposed to be therefore all Ghanaians are human beings.
Okay. Okay. Thank you, sir.
And then the second one, all A are C, all B are C, therefore all A are B. If all A are C and all B are also C, it doesn't necessarily mean then that all A are B. Example, all Ghanaians are Africans, all Kenyans are Africans, therefore all Ghanaians are Kenyans. Doesn't necessarily follow. So the fact that all A are C and all B are C doesn't tell you anything about the relationship between A and B. Okay, so disjunctive syllogism, either A is true or B is true. A is true, so B is false. Either A is true or B is true. B is true, so A is false. Either I became a reverend father or I got married. I got married, so I did not become a reverend father. Or either I became a reverend father or I got married. I became a reverend father, so I did not get married. So that's why we call it a disjunctive syllogism. So that was that about the four types of deductive reasoning. You have modus ponens, affirming the antecedent. Then you have the fallacy of denying the antecedent. Then you have modus tollens, denying the consequent. And then you have the fallacy of affirming the consequent. Then you have hypothetical syllogism, and then you saw two fallacies of hypothetical syllogism. Then we have disjunctive syllogism. Then you have this relationship between validity and soundness. A valid argument is not necessarily a sound argument. An argument is valid if it follows the deductive rules. Any argument that affirms the antecedent is valid, whether the argument is true or not. Any argument that denies the consequent is valid, whether the argument is true or not. So that's how, and any argument that follows the rule of hypothetical syllogism is valid, whether the information is given you in the premises and conclusion is true or not. Okay. Valid but not sound. Valid but not sound. All human beings are immortal. Peter is a human being, therefore Peter is immortal. So this argument is valid because it affirms the antecedent. The only problem is that mortal was changed to immortal. So the argument is not true, but it is valid. So if you go to a valid argument and then you change certain information from true to false, the argument is still valid. The only problem is that the argument is no longer true. And if an argument is valid but not true, we say the argument is not sound. An argument that is valid but not true is an argument that is not sound, an unsound argument. Okay. All men are members. All members must get killed. Therefore, all men must get killed. So it is a valid deductive argument. But it is not a sound argument because there is false information in the argument, despite the fact that the argument is valid. Okay, so I think that's the main thing you need to understand about validity and soundness. And from here, we looked at inductive reasoning. Inductive. Let's get inductive reasoning, which we actually did. And then we were comparing inductive reasoning to deductive reasoning. And we saw that for the inductive reasoning, there's no logical relationship between the premises and conclusion. For inductive reasoning, you can assert the premises and deny the conclusion. The premises could be saying one thing, and then the conclusions could be saying another. We don't regard it as a contradiction. We don't regard it as a contradiction, because an inductive argument is essentially an explorative argument. It's an argument that is trying to explore the world. So we don't subject it to strict logical rules. Okay, so for inductive arguments, premises provide reason for believing in a likelihood of the conclusion, but premises do not guarantee the conclusion. So we call inductive arguments probability arguments. And we saw different kinds of inductive arguments. We saw, but before that, we distinguished between verifiable and confirmable statements. And we said that the premises are normally verifiable statements, and then the conclusions are normally confirmable statements. Then we saw the two ways of detecting confirmable statements. Confirmable statements are not directly verifiable, and secondly, they can be converted into
Hello, sir.
Conditional statements.
Hello.
Yes.
I wanted to verify something.
Yes, go ahead.
I have a question here. You say you either save at Fidelity Bank or Zenith Bank. You save at Fidelity Bank, therefore you do not save at Zenith Bank. I wanted to find out whether it's a disjunctive syllogism.
Yeah, that is a disjunctive syllogism at face value. At face value, because in real terms, you can save in both banks. So that kind of argument will not be, you cannot obtain it as a disjunctive argument in the real world. But at face value, it comes across as a disjunctive argument.
Okay.
Yes, so disjunctive arguments have to reflect the state of affairs in the real world. They have to refer to state of affairs that are truly disjunctive. All right, so two ways of, now we saw the law-like and statistical hypothesis. We reminded ourselves of the distinction between finite and infinite reference classes. We say the finite reference classes are the classes of countable items. Examples, this copper, that man, some boys, that table. And then the infinite reference class is a class of uncountable items. When you talk about all metals, all men, all voters. And then we used this distinction to distinguish between law-like and statistical hypothesis. We say the law-like hypotheses are confirmable statements that refer to all members of a class. For instance, all metals expand when heated. That's a hypothesis that refers to all members of a class. We call it a law-like hypothesis. Then we saw the statistical hypothesis, confirmable statements referring to some percentage less than 100% and more than 0%. 90% of those who ate the food fell sick. That's a statistical hypothesis, which is what most scientists use. We talked about the disadvantages of using law-like hypothesis for scientific experiments. It's not very easy to do that. So the statistical hypotheses are usually more realistic for investigations. Then we saw the distinction between inductive and deductive reasoning. We said inductive arguments are aimed at confirmation, and then deductive arguments are aimed at proof. But confirmation is not as strong as proof. Then we saw the two kinds of inductive arguments based on the kind of hypothesis. So we have two classes of inductive arguments. We have those with law-like hypothesis as conclusion, and then we have those with statistical hypothesis as conclusion. So those are the two categories of inductive arguments. And then we talked about inductive arguments as extrapolations, but I think we'll just go over this. We'll say there are different types of extrapolations. You have generalizations, you have part-whole extrapolations, you have analogies, and then we have predictions. And so we ended with the two types of inductive arguments based on the kind of conclusion. Either the conclusion is a law-like hypothesis or the conclusion is a statistical hypothesis. All right. Then we went to causal reasoning. Causal reasoning, which we did very recently. We said it's a type of inductive reasoning that focuses on causal relationships. Reasoning from cause to effect, sometimes from effect to cause. What causes what? How do we know it is the cause? We saw the different senses of the word cause. We saw proximate cause, the immediate cause of something. We saw contributory cause, a cause among many other causes. We saw necessary cause, which we say is a cause as necessary condition. We saw sufficient cause. We saw the difference between necessary and sufficient cause. We said something could have several necessary causes. For instance, human life could have several necessary causes, such as oxygen, life, food, sunlight. But then the sufficient cause of human life is a different ball game. You need to assemble all the necessary causes that are sufficient for human life, if at all you know all of them. Then we saw probabilistic cause, which is the opposite of necessary cause. And then we have causal agent, we have causal chain, we have causal web. We give examples of each. And then from there, we went into the different kinds of causal reasoning. We focused on three major types of informal causal reasoning, which all of us utilize every day in our daily affairs. We saw relevant difference reasoning, we saw common thread reasoning, we saw concomitant variation reasoning. We saw how these three kinds of reasoning work, in our daily lives. For the relevant difference, we give an example with someone who takes tea all the time, but began experiencing stomach problems after taking tea. And we said all the person had to do was to look for what he was doing differently when he takes tea. And that was how he found out the cause of the illness. We saw common thread reasoning, which is identifying something that is common to all cases of a particular thing. Then we saw concomitant variation, which is to measure degrees rather than mere existence. When you have to measure the degrees of something rather than its mere existence, then that is concomitant variation reasoning. We saw the examples, and from there we looked at causal fallacies. We saw post hoc, ego propter hoc, the fallacy of inferring causality from chronology. This is the fallacy of assuming that because A happened before B, A must have caused B. Whatever happens before something else must have caused it. That's the fallacy of post hoc, ego propter hoc. So it is not always the case that if something happened before something, it must have caused it. Then we saw non-causal pro-causal, which is the fallacy of exchanging cause for effect. And we saw how this fallacy creeps into our analysis. We saw it is easy to commit this fallacy when we are describing something and what causes it. For instance, Michael is a poor student because he performs poorly in examinations. But the real issue is that Michael performs poorly in examination because he's a poor student. So that is non-causal pro-causal. Sometimes if you don't correct it, it leads to problems in your argument. Let's assume you are writing an article and you are committing non-causal pro-causal somewhere, and it misleads you about causal relationships. Of course, you can see that non-causal pro-causal can mislead you seriously when you are dealing with causal relationships in an investigation. Oversimplified cause. When there are many causes and the argument identifies only one of them as a cause. Then we have false common thread. When we identify something as a common thread that is not actually a common thread. Then we have confusing correlation with causation. When we conclude that just because two things always happen together, one of them must be causing the other. That's a fallacy of confusing correlation with causation. Correlation does not always mean causation. Slippery slope, when we assume that if something happens, then it will give rise to a chain of consequences that will lead to something else that is totally out of the ball game. So that's slippery slope. Okay. So that was that about causal reasoning. From causal reasoning, we went on to our last class of the semester, which is the informal fallacies. And we were saying that there are other groups of fallacies apart from the formal fallacies we saw in deductive reasoning, the fallacies of meaning we saw in the meaning defects in language, the causal reasoning fallacies we saw in causal reasoning. We still have other groups of fallacies. So for a total list of fallacies, you can consult some other textbooks. Like there's a textbook on critical thinking, understanding and applying critical thinking, that is at the university bookshop, the Kingdom Bookshop, just beside the BAM library. There you'll find a book containing up to 38 fallacies, which is very interesting. But for this semester, we just singled out 12 fallacies, some of which we've already treated in our last classes. For instance, you have the fallacies of meaning. We already saw equivocation. We saw secularity. But in this case, we're talking about secularity in argument, defending something by repeating it. Then you have grandstanding, which is to appeal to the majority, to say that something is correct simply because of the number of people that practice it, or that believe it. That's grandstanding. That's appeal to majority. The fallacy of appeal to majority. Then we have ad hominem, which is personality praises or attacks. We saw the positive and the negative. Defending an argument by praising the proponent, by praising its proponent. And then the negative is to reject an argument by insulting or criticizing the lifestyle of its proponent. That's negative ad hominem. Then we have illegitimate appeal to authority, when you defend a position by simply appealing to the educational or whatever authority of its proponent. Then we have genetic fallacy, as the fallacy of assuming that something is right or wrong depending on its geographical origin, or its chronological origin, or its contextual origin. And then we have appeal to threat, when you are defending something by saying what will happen to people if they don't believe it. Then we have appeal to pity. Then we have the fallacies of manipulating data, We saw three of them. We saw the fallacy of misplaced vividness, which is to deflect attention from a general problem by focusing too much on a few particularly vivid and provocative cases. And then we saw the fallacy of semi-attached figures, which is the deceitful use of statistics, defending a hypothesis by utilizing some research that is not entirely relevant to the conclusion, to the hypothesis. Then we saw hasty generalization, which is to generalize something about an entire population based on samples that are too few. Hasty generalization. Hasty generalization is actually an inductive fallacy. We didn't treat inductive fallacies, which is one of the deficiencies of the book that we're using for critical thinking. But in the other book at the BAM library, at the bookshop, you see hasty generalization and other inductive fallacies which have been specified as inductive fallacies. Okay, so that was the end of the semester. And at this point, I think we should just take a few questions before we round up, and then we upload our recording for others to watch. So any questions? Esther?
Hello, sir.
Yes, go ahead.
Sir, please, I want to know, with the genetic fallacy, do we have the ecologistic and then dialogistic of it, unlike the ad hominem fallacy?
No, the types of genetic fallacy we have. Well, it's possible that some other textbook has described the different types of genetic fallacy with different names, but I wouldn't know those names. What I know is that genetic fallacies come in the forms of the genetic fallacies of geographical origin, the genetic fallacies of chronological origin, genetic fallacies of contextual origin. So these three, if you are concluding that something is right or wrong based on where it comes from or the time in history that it existed, or its context, a particular context. So those are the three forms of the genetic fallacy.
Okay, sir. Thank you, sir. Sir, please, can you throw more light on the difference between the hasty generalization and the misplaced vividness? I'm sort of confused between the two.
Yes, I think we had explained that in our in our causal reasoning class. Or was it causal reasoning or that? No, our last class on informal fallacies. Hasty generalization is to make a conclusion about a whole population based on what you observed with a few samples. So if you observe something about a few samples and you assume that it applies to an entire population, that is hasty generalization. But for misplaced vividness, when you are denying a general problem by citing a few lucky examples that counter the general problem. That is misplaced vividness.
Okay, sir. Thank you, sir.
You're welcome. All right, so at this point, we've come quite a long way. Peter, go ahead with your question.
Yes, sir. So with the disjunctive syllogism or disjunctive statement, when you have a statement which is disjunctive, does that mean that the person chooses one, the person dislikes the other? For example, when we have a statement that he comes before God, that he chooses between heaven and earth, heaven and hell, he chooses heaven. Does that mean that he really hates her or doesn't like her. When you come across this disjunctive, does it mean that the person doesn't like the author?
Yeah, I was telling you that disjunctive statements apply to disjunctive situations. So if you are choosing situations that are characterized by either or. So if it is not a situation characterized by either or, then a disjunctive statement cannot apply to it. So if you have any doubt about whether the two situations you are talking about are truly disjunctive, then it means that a disjunctive statement probably cannot apply to that situation. So, and it also doesn't have anything to do with whether you like something or not, whether you like what you have rejected. No, it's not about your feeling. It is that if you choose one, you have automatically denied another. That's the meaning of a disjunctive. All right, so at this point, I'm going to have to end the class so that we can upload the recording. And then at this point, I can only tell you to work hard, prepare for your exams, make sure you come out in flying colors, and continue to be good ambassadors of the university. So until we see in some other class, I guess at this point we should be telling each other farewell. All right. So
Okay, thank you.
Farewell to you too. Okay. So,
Thank you, sir.
sir, does that mean you're not going to meet you again?
I was saying until we meet somewhere else.
Yeah.
Okay, sir. Thank you so much.
Look at the first subject.